I'm Ruben Mahaffey, a chemistry, biology, and general science teacher in Spruce Grove at Spruce Grove Composite High School. And this talk is called Schooled by COVID, in which I'll talk about some of my reflections on COVID-19 as compared to the Spanish flu of 1918-1919. How did I respond to emergency remote teaching and pandemic teaching in my own classroom? And what were some of the things that worked for me? What things didn't work for me? And then what were the things that I learned throughout that whole process? Like a lot of you, probably, I felt like a first-year teacher where I was constantly behind the eight ball, putting things together at the last minute, throwing things against the wall, and seeing what would stick. But I remembered, too, that first-year teachers are creative, and they're reflective. And I did a lot of reflecting throughout this period. And there were three big realizations that I came to. First of all, that teaching only works when it's student-centered. And that's true in pandemic emergency teaching. That's true in classroom teaching too, but that was really brought into focus for me. Number two, that there are always inequities present in our school systems. They're amplified when we're doing emergency remote teaching, but those inequities are always there. And number three, that I didn't miss diploma exams. Not even a little bit. Emergency remote teaching allowed me to imagine a world where there weren't diploma exams. And I'm starting to think that's a world I might like to live in. I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more at the end of the talk. Originally, I had intended for this to be an interactive discussion, right? When I had proposed this talk, we didn't know what convention would look like, and I had hoped that it might be in person. It's not. But I do still want to ask questions of you, because my experiences are one thing, but each of you have your own experiences that you've had during COVID. You have things that have worked well for you. You have things that have failed miserably. And you have things that you've learned about teaching and learning and assessment. And so what I'm going to do is to ask some of the questions that I normally would have asked in this talk on Twitter, using my Twitter handle @RubenMahaffey. And I'd encourage you to join the discussion there so that we can sort of asynchronously have that same discussion. Here's my wonderful family. My wife, Alana Mahaffey, is a music teacher at Hilwy Hampton School, so I'm sure she's out in the virtual audience cheering me on. My kids, Caleb and Briar. And like I said, I'm a secondary chemistry, biology, and general science teacher in Spruce Grove at Spruce Grove Composite High School. And so what I want to talk about today is these four big ideas. So number one, comparing Spanish flu to COVID-19. We've seen, I'm sure you like me have seen comparisons of this already, so I don't want to rehash things, but I do want to focus a bit on how schools responded in 1918 and how schools responded today, because I was surprised at some of the similarities that I saw there. Number two, how did we respond to emergency remote teaching? So I'll talk a bit about what I did and the things that then I learned about teaching and learning as a result of that. And then number four, which I think is kind of the whole impetus of this, how can we apply the things that we've learned during emergency remote teaching as we've flip-flopped back and forth in and out of the classroom, as we've had students isolating, big portions of students isolating. Maybe you've been teaching from home because you've been isolating. Maybe you've been doing a talking head kind of Wizard of Oz instruction at the front of the classroom. Right? All of those things gave powerful lessons about teaching and learning. So how can we apply those to improve education going forward so that we don't rush to too quickly return to what we've always done, but maybe can make some improvements in the process? So I'm recording this in the final days of 2020, and of course now it's 2021. So 2021, how is it? I'm sure future me is really enjoying it. I'm sure that I'm vaccinated, going over to all my friends' houses, drinking late into the night at bars with groups of random strangers, hugging people on the street. No? Not yet, eh? Well, the crazy thing is, of course, we've been through this before, right? Well, or we haven't, but the world has been through this before, many times. And most recently, about 100 years ago. And I won't bore you with all of the Spanish flu minutiae that you've heard and have heard rehashed, that sort of thing. But there are interesting parallels to draw between what we're going through now and what we went through in 1918 and 1919 and 1920. And 2021's better, right? So here are a couple of interesting things. This is from the Ontario Provincial Board of Health regarding the response to the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu has landed in Ontario shortly before this. This is October of 1918. And this memo is outlining what the response is going to be. So it says health authorities have the power to close schools and churches and theaters and other places. But when asked what to do, they've said the weight of public health authority is against closing such places, except perhaps in country districts for the following reasons. In cities and towns, it's impossible to prevent children commingling in the streets and playgrounds without the supervision found in schools. Hence, closing schools is more effective in country districts. Closing schools is economically wasteful and usually has no influence on the course of an outbreak of disease like influenza. Children are less likely to infect one another in a classroom than in the home or on the playground. As a rule, better results will be achieved by daily inspection of school children, for example, such as in cities like Toronto. It was true that schools with a public health nurse were more effective in controlling spread of Spanish flu than schools without, and that was a big driver for public health nurses in schools. But the schools ended up closing. So this is Ontario again. The exceptionally severe weather during the winter of 1918 and the outbreak of Spanish flu during the autumn of the same year greatly interfered with the routine of inspection. This is coming from a school inspector. And in cases, schools were closed for considerable periods, ranging from 1 week to 3 months. In Edmonton, it was similar. So here's Edmonton Journal from October 24, 1918. Spanish flu comes to Edmonton a little while after. It comes to Alberta on a troop car carrying soldiers back from Eastern Canada, and that brings Spanish flu with it. So at the time of this paper, Edmonton's death roll from Spanish flu shows steady increase. There are 7 people who have died here already. Interesting parallel here too, if you look at the subheading. Gauze masks are proven effective by local physicians. So a splendid protection, it says, that a gauze mask is a powerful and effective protection against Spanish influenza has been proven by experiments by local physicians. In order to test the effectiveness of this mask, a badly infected patient was asked to sneeze several times with the mask on. Examination of a plate held closely to the mask showed no trace whatever of any flu germ, thoroughly demonstrating the protection in wearing this gauze recommended by the Provincial Board of Health. It is confidently felt that the wearing of these masks was genuinely adopted by the public. The influenza would disappear in 5 days, which that sort of optimism is interesting. Early term optimism, right? There are 2 more years of Spanish flu to come after this. But if we all just wear our masks, we should be able to wipe it out in the better part of a week. And the masks were worn, right? So here are telephone operators in 1918 wearing masks that look quite similar to homemade masks today. But then closures happened. So we're now October 18, 1918. Public places in Edmonton closed tonight. Schools, churches, theaters must cease starting on October 18 until further notice. And they didn't reopen until after the Christmas break, at which point special precautions were taken to prevent the spread of influenza. Some of those precautions will sound familiar here too. So pupils suffering from colds or coming from homes having influenza will be excluded from school until they have secured certificates from City Medical Health Officer, which is interesting, or from the Medical Inspector of Schools, or from the school nurse who will act under his direction. Every assurance is given that careful and strict supervision will be maintained in order to safeguard the health of the pupils. So this is about a week later now, January 11th, and there's a confident report in the paper of no influenza in local schools. 12 of the leading schools of the city have reported to the medical officer that not one case of influenza has been noticed since the opening of schools. And the Chief Medical Officer, a Dr. Whiteclaw, states that many parents who are keeping the children from school because they fear exposing them to the epidemic are alarming themselves unnecessarily. At the school, the pupils are watched with the keenest vigilance, and owing to the excellent ventilation, they are in many cases far safer at school than they are at home. If we zoom forward about 100 years in the Edmonton Journal to this past year, we see 3 headlines that are surprisingly similar to the 3 headlines we just saw. So the first here, schools being closed, that announcement came on March 15th. There are 17 new cases of COVID-19 at that time, and school was suspended indefinitely, until September was what they said. But as we knew at that time, we didn't know necessarily that we were coming back in September at that time. And then we have the announcement to reopen schools with measures to limit the spread of COVID-19, including staying home if you're sick, and those sorts of things. And then about a week after schools reopened, we have an interview with the education minister saying that everything's going really well. Right? School reentry plan is working. There were some cases in schools at this time. But what Dr. Hinshaw was announcing at this time was that there was no evidence of transmission within the school, which was very confident at that time. And as we know, the schools didn't stay open until Christmas. But the similarities don't end there. So the Alberta Teachers Alliance, which is going to become the Alberta Teachers Association, which is quite young in the 19-teens, is quoted here as going to the Minister of Education. They're asking for a number of things, but included in that list is epidemic regulations, because teachers then, like now, are teaching during a pandemic and are struggling as a result. And so the Alberta Teachers Alliance is going to bat for them. And the same today. So here's Jason Schilling in the Edmonton Journal making some noise and trying to get a meeting with Adriana LaGrange, the Minister of Education. Again, about school safety, right? Pandemic regulations, epidemic regulations. I don't know about you, but I have a very vivid memory of hearing about going to emergency remote teaching. I remember sitting down with my colleagues, spaced out in my classroom, nobody wearing masks because we weren't really doing that yet, and talking about what we were going to do. We assumed that we were going to be told that we were going online, they were shutting down the schools, and how are we going to do it, right? What were our priorities? And at that time, the priorities were big on asynchronicity. We wanted to be flexible, to be gracious for students so they could complete work when they needed to. We didn't know how they were dealing with this, with the pandemic, right? All the schools were shut down. Are they needing to do childcare during the day? Are they needing to be working during the day? So trying to make sure that school is as accessible as possible to them. Talking about how we're going to prepare and deliver lessons. We bought a bunch of document cameras and tablets, right, to try to make sure that we were prepared. How are we going to design assessments? And then, of course, grabbing a box of all the crap that we thought we'd need, right? This is my colleague Brad Langdale's box, where he's taken his Hot Wheels and a bunch of polarizing filters and some stuff written in Japanese for some reason. That's his box, right? And the stuff that he thought he'd need in order to make it through the rest of the semester. I had a huge cart full of crap that I brought home. I had a great group of students that was looking after this garden tower, and I murdered all of these plant babies before I went home because we didn't know when we would be back, and I couldn't just leave this thing here. As far as we knew, we weren't going to be allowed back into the building for the rest of the year. And I took this picture just to mostly show them I was sad, and then I couldn't send it to them. And the sort of leader of this group sent me an email. I think it was like right at the end of the year, at June, saying, hey, how are the plants doing? And I had to tell her that I had murdered them all. I think she knew. She really knew that that had happened already. But what about the teaching end of things, though? Like a lot of you, when I went to emergency remote teaching in March, I felt a lot like a first-year teacher again. I wasn't really sure what I was doing. A lot of the materials that I had built up and the assessments and activities and lessons that I knew worked really well, they didn't work anymore. And I felt lost. But then I realized that feeling like a first-year teacher isn't only a bad thing, right? First year teachers are inventive, they're creative, they're bold, they're not afraid to try new things. They know that a lot of the things that they do are going to flop. And so I tried to build on that energy of being a first year teacher again to use that in a positive way. And so what did I do? Well, like a lot of you, I made videos. And I made videos, and I made videos, and I made videos. And they started off not very good. They started off with a lot of me recording over my notes, doing what I would have done anyways in class, or some kind of simplified version of that. VF on one side, though, I must divide by VF on the other side as well. So now this is my new formula. And they got better as they went along, and I realized, among other things, that there were some advantages to making an asynchronous video, that I could show students things or do things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do very easily in a classroom setting. And so I started making some videos like that as well. We will need a locant as well to tell us where the hydroxyl group is. And once I know how many moles of my product will form, then I can figure out what mass that represents for the product, as long as I know the molar mass, which I do. So then here I have my product. It gets named with the part that came from the alcohol as a branch, and the part that came from the carboxylic acid gets named as the parent chain. So this guy started out as methanol, so it'll be a methyl, and then this guy started out as ethanoic acid, so it'll be ethanoate. So the full name of this ester will be methyl ethanoate, and water will be the byproduct. An ice table. You have to take one of them, throw it up in the air, and whip the other one at it. And you can do that over and over and over and over again. Show catalyzed reactions with a dotted line like this. They are acting like an enzyme because they grab the one with their one active site, they grab the other one with their other active site, and they bring them together in just the correct orientation.
Oh, hey man, are we working on that isomers video now? Like, I was just getting ready to help you with that.
Okay, not now.
Can I,
try to make my videos. Now you'll see the reaction on your screen. Somewhere. I'll put it in the video. I don't know where it's going to be, but one of these points will be funny to it. And I realized also that I had my kids around, which was really special. And so I brought my kids in and had my kids participate in videos when I could and when I had the time to incorporate them into it. And that was really fun. Tasting a little bit of our number 2. See what it tastes like. What does it taste like? Does it taste sweet?
Yes, very sweet.
Very sweet.
Sweeter than honey.
Who are our helpers today?
Caleb!
And?
Ryan!
Fryer. This stuff is called Tang. You guys are each going to take 3 scoops of Tang and put them into your container. 1. Good. 2. Now, does this look like a regular pop can, Caleb?
No.
Oh, it looks pretty regular to me. Is there anything funny about it?
It looks more like it reminds me of a wagon.
Oh, okay. Well, it reminds you of a wagon too? I'm going to set it onto here. What happened to the can? It broke! And we realized that we could do creative things with assessment too, and designing activities for students, right? Because they were missing out on the labs that we would normally be doing, and that's such an important part of science education. And so one of those things was creating a model kit out of found objects. Because in Chemistry 30 organic chemistry, building models is a really important part of understanding chemical structure and bonding. So we had them create model kits with things that they could find around their house, and the results were awesome and really varied. One of the things that struck me was how when students were on their own, they inherently became much more creative because you can't look over and see what your neighbor is doing or what the group next to you is doing. Well, you can snap tweet them or whatever the kids are doing now, but I think to a large extent they didn't. They kind of sat down and they came up with these ideas on their own, and that was really cool. And we had students create acid-base indicators using red cabbage, and one of the challenges, of course, was that they were at home and not everybody has red cabbage in their pantry or their vegetable crisper. So I set up a survey to see who had access to cabbage and who would need to pick up to the school. And this was, the spring. So there were a lot of people who weren't leaving the house. And one of the things that I included was an option for me to mail out cabbage to their house. And I did lots of diligent research on how to mail cabbage. And I sent cabbage in the mail, and it did not arrive. And I don't know if I triggered some sort of Canada Post scanner or something like that. So I ended up dropping off cabbage to this person's house. But then students did a acid-base indicator project, right? Where they created this cabbage juice indicator in their own kitchen, and then they could investigate household chemicals and make some comparisons of their acidity. And they had to make a video for me showing their process, and those are really fantastic as well.
Very dark purple to get best results. This is what you want your end product to end up looking like.
And in general, I found that having students make their own video was really effective. Even if it wasn't something fancy, but just having them make a video showing their process thinking, doing a word problem, or explaining a simple concept like,
why does the hydrogen carbonate ion act as a base?
This hydrogen carbonate ion will react with the water and take one of its hydrogens. This forms carbonic acid, which will be a cation, and hydroxide.
But these more involved projects also started to reveal some of the issues with this asynchronous approach. The students who really took the time and had the ability and the resources to dive into them left with a really solid understanding, a really deep understanding of the concepts that we were learning. But the more involved the assignment was, even though these were fairly faithfully sticking to the 3-hour per week per course requirement, the more involved the project was, the greater the number of students that dropped off and the fewer submissions that we got in. And so that means that some students were leaving with a very well-rounded understanding of the material, and some students were not engaging with the material at all. And that was a key decision-making piece going into emergency remote learning the second time around. Just as a note too, this assignment that's up here where students created a calorimeter at home, it worked really well. We had to give some materials out, including a triple beam balance, and without us there to help students figure out how to use it for the first time, and probably the greatest number of emails that I got with students having issues with anything that we did in all of emergency remote learning was students trying to figure out how to use this triple beam balance. Another interesting observation is when students were doing their work. So these two charts show the hits on my YouTube videos for 2 random days when students were working in Chemistry 20 and Chemistry 30. And you see that some students are doing their work during the regular school day, so they're fairly active between 10 and sort of 3 or 4 o'clock. Interestingly, there are no hits on anything before 10 a.m. On the Tuesday here, there are no hits before 11 a.m., even though I'm at my computer at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and I'm available by 8:30 for students. And then the other thing that I found interesting was the kind of die-off of activity around supper time, and then this spike of activity later on in the evening. So on the Monday here, we see a big spike at 11 a.m. There are some people who are watching videos between 11 and 12. And then on the Tuesday, between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m., there's another kind of batch of hits. So some of the students have shifted their schedules back. And because it's asynchronous, they're able to do that. They're completing their work at night. And as long as they're completing their work, right, that's okay. And as long as they can get access to me that they need. But that was what I found an interesting observation. And I know that's borne out by research elsewhere, that the regular school day for teenagers is not the optimal time for them to be learning. And this seemed to bear that out when students have total freedom to choose when they do their schoolwork. Some of them were doing it later in the morning and in the afternoon, but some of them were doing it quite late at night. And so as we got to the end of the semester, I sat down with my colleagues and we talked about what worked and what didn't work. And so what were some of the things that worked? Well, asynchronous worked really well for some of the students. It was flexible. They can access videos anytime. They collaborated in interesting ways. Culling the curriculum too helped me anyways to identify what were the most important things. What are the key parts of the curriculum that are really important. I'd never had that flexibility before, right? To omit things that I thought were superfluous or maybe not as useful as other things, and to do a deeper dive on some of the curriculum items that I thought were more important. The list of what didn't work was a lot bigger. So the asynchronous, it worked for some people. As you know, it was terrible for a lot of students. It was really hard to give feedback for me. I felt like I was answering about 1 billion emails every day. Summative assessments were hard. Chasing the kids that fell off the face of the earth and disappeared for one reason or another. Some of them were really good reasons. Some of them were really bad reasons. It was really hard to sift through and figure out which were the kids that actually needed support and which were the kids that were just playing video games all day. And for those kids, how to support them, right? How to bring them back in. But the chasing those kids down, dealing with excuses, chasing them again, that was a big challenge, of course. And it was really isolating for students, isolating for teachers too. And then the really obvious issues like access to technology, access to broadband internet for students who didn't have those things. Those were major barriers to success. So as we went online again in November this year, there were different considerations. We looked at that list of things that didn't work and we improved on them. And I know a lot of you did that too. So my colleagues and I, when we were looking at that list, we looked at the disengagement, chasing kids, having difficulty with students just being able to keep up, especially given that we were running quarters like a lot of you were, and are having to do the full curriculum. It's like in the spring, if a student dropped off for a week, they would miss 3 hours of instruction. But now it's almost 3 hours a day. And so if they drop off for a week, they're missing 15 hours of instruction. And that would just be insurmountable in a lot of cases, right? If you disappear for a week in order to be able to get caught up again. So things were a lot different, mostly synchronous, running Google Meets, right? Lots of breakout rooms, but that came with its own set of challenges. For me, I know one of the challenges was I had 2 classes this past quarter that I didn't have in the spring. I didn't have any online materials prepared for them. So I was doing synchronous stuff during most of the day and then prepping things at night and on the weekend, building Moodle quizzes and building lessons, trying to figure out how Mentimeter worked to do synchronous feedback kind of stuff, using electronic whiteboards. And it was really, really challenging. So this is what it looked like at the beginning. I had realized that my students hadn't seen me without my mask off, so I shaved my beard to a mustache and then just insisted that I'd always had one. which I think I found a lot funnier than they did. But this is what I looked like then at the beginning of emergency remote, so end of November. And then by the time we went out to December break, this was me. So this was a photo that I took after my last class after I'd shut down my last class on the Friday before Christmas break. And I took a photo to cheers all of my colleagues who were doing the same thing. And then I looked at it afterwards and I'm like, holy cow, I look haggard. I look like I've aged 10 years in that month that we had been doing online teaching. I had felt in a lot of ways like I had aged 10 years too, because it was just a lot. So throughout this whole process, I ended up with 3 big takeaways. First of all, teaching only works when it's student-centered. And that's obvious, right? That's what education is all about. But this more so than a regular classroom experience, where I have all of my materials that have been finely tuned and work well, and I can try a new activity here or there. This was a totally new experience for me and a totally new experience for students. And it really reminded me that everything that I did had to be thinking about where the students are coming from. What do they have access to? What kind of time do they have? What can they accomplish on their own? And what's reasonable for me to expect of them? And the inequities that students experience at home during emergency remote learning, those inequities are always there, right? Those are present in the classroom too. They're just sometimes less obvious because you don't get to peer inside students' houses and you don't get to see what's going on in the background or experience the students who don't turn their camera on because they are embarrassed about where they live, or they don't turn their camera on because they're sharing a space with 5 other people and it's just too busy and crazy. Or the people who don't participate because they don't have access to reliable Wi-Fi, or they can't print things because they can't afford a printer and paper. These are things that are real inequities that limit students during emergency remote teaching and in emergency remote learning. But we have to remember that those same students are disadvantaged in a regular day, in a regular classroom. And just because they're in front of us makes it seem less significant, but those things are still there. And number 3, and this was a big one, I was teaching a diploma exam course. I was teaching Biology 30 in the spring, and I've taught Biology 30 again then in quarter 1 and quarter 2 this year. And I didn't miss the diploma exams. I didn't miss them at all. And I was a little bit surprised about that, in part because I firmly believe that the diploma exams are a very high quality machine scored test. At least in science, they're currently machine scored only, right? We don't have a written response component. I've been involved in item writing for chemistry and the biology diploma exams. And I know the amount of time and work and effort that goes into creating those diploma exams. I know that each question has been so carefully machined and tested and reworked, and those are very excellent questions. Also, I know that doing that item writing for me has been probably the best professional development that I have done in my career. It's phenomenal. I have become a better teacher as a result, and mostly I've become a better assessor. I've become better at creating assessments that work well, that are as fair as they can be, and I've become much better at writing machine-scored items. And in some ways, in writing long form or written items as well, in thinking about which things are best assessed with a machine-scored item, or which things are best assessed in a long form, or can be best assessed in either way. But just because that works well for me, it doesn't mean that the diploma exam is the best thing for the students. And that's what this whole experience has left me with this really distinct impression of, is the diploma exam is not the best thing for the students. And so if the student is at the center of education, that has to be a primary consideration. Now, what are the other considerations? Well, let's start with the diploma exam bulletins and the material that's going to be covered on the diploma exam. But I realized in part how much energy I needed to put in a regular year to make sure that not only was I teaching the curriculum, which is important, and I'm bound to teach the curriculum, but also interpreting the curriculum in the same way as the diploma examiners, and teaching students the methods that the diploma examiners would be expecting them to use. Pouring through the information bulletins to remind myself how each outcome was being interpreted and what level of detail is required. And I found that having the ability to make those decisions for myself in a diploma level course, in a 30 level course, in the same way that we already do in non-diploma courses. So in high school, that would be courses like Science 10, Chemistry 20, Biology 20, right, Physics 20. In those courses, we have the ability to make all of these little decisions about how much detail do I want to include. Do I want to focus more here, or do I want to focus less here? And for me anyways, having that ability in those courses allows them to be much stronger courses. Allows me to go deeper on some curriculum items and to build a course that not only addresses the knowledge outcomes in the curriculum, but also the other ones. Because a diploma exam, as an assessment of learning, gives us information about where students are at a particular point in time. I won't argue that the test is without value. I think that it does have value, but my argument is that the diploma exam has very limited value for the student actually taking the exam. Because what the diploma exam does is it communicates to other people how a particular group of students is doing. And on the broad scale at the statistical level, can give us information about groups of students. Also, I'll argue that the diploma exam is problematic because it heavily favors the knowledge outcomes in the program of studies. The exam contains a lot of knowledge questions, basic knowledge level questions, some attempts to integrate STS outcomes, and some skills, but the skills that are tested here are heavily constrained by the type of test that it is. That it's a machine-scored test, but also that this is a written test. A lot of the important aspects, like attitudes, the nature of science bit, skills including initiating planning, performing recording, communication teamwork, and analyzing and interpreting outside of the scope of a written response question, they can't really be tested here. These grade 12 courses are the crown jewel in our science program. These students have been working up to them throughout their time in K-12. We should be turning the reins over to those students for them to design experiments, to follow lines of inquiry, to solve problems, and to work together to solve those problems. And maybe you do find a way to do that already, and if so, let me know how you do it. But I know that I don't do nearly as much of that as I would like to, and most of my colleagues don't do nearly as much of that as they would like to either. And when we talk about this, the discussion often comes back to, well, I don't have time. Sure, it would be great to set up this inquiry-based thing, to have students figure out this idea on their own, to have them do some kind of, bigger project in this grade 12 course. But there's not time. We have so much content that we need to cover that there isn't time to do. And I'd always thought that the rate limiting factor here, the thing that caused us to not have enough time, was the curriculum. Right? There are too many outcomes in the curriculum. But this experience of not having a diploma exam and getting to imagine this world where I cover the curriculum, but I get to design my own final assessments, well, this world has made me think that maybe it's not the curriculum that's the problem. Maybe it's the diploma exam. And maybe because of the focus of the diploma exam, I, as a science teacher, become too myopic. I become too focused on the knowledge outcomes, and I become too focused on the diploma exam bulletin and its comment about how I should cover those knowledge outcomes. Well, in this case, I can't say it better than Peter Mahaffey, who, full disclosure, is my dad. He's also a university-level chemistry educator, and he's talking here about first-year introductory chemistry classes, but there are very strong parallels with our grade 12 diploma exam classes as well. So Peter says, first-year chemistry instructors create a tyranny of covering content rather than uncovering the spectacular power of chemistry as a central science that is relevant to professions in many fields and to every citizen. And so what he's saying is that we become so preoccupied with the knowledge components of our course that we lose sight of the skills, the attitudes, and the nature of science bits that are equally as important, if not more so, to developing a scientific understanding of how science works, and for building skills that students are going to need as students move on from high school science. With more freedom in how teachers prepare their final assessments, they can much more creatively design their courses and much more authentically assess the real science skills that their students are developing over the course of a semester. Time can be allotted within the course of a semester for students to conduct in-depth investigations where they are put in the driver's seat and they are encouraged to become the investigators and they are taught how to become scientists. You don't become a scientist by memorizing how to do an enthalpy calculation or regurgitating the parts of the reproductive system. You become a scientist by asking questions. You become a scientist by considering possibilities, by testing things, by making mistakes. And sure, you need to remember things. I'm not suggesting we do away with assessment altogether, but I'm suggesting that teachers should be put in the driver's seat, classroom teachers, and given the autonomy to design final assessments that suit their context and allow them to give the skills and the attitudes portions of the curriculum the attention that they deserve. For example, in Chemistry 20, we have recently revamped our lab program and concluded it with a practical lab final, which tests lab skills. And this is something that we wouldn't even consider in Chemistry 30, because even if we wanted to take the time to do it, that we don't carve out the time to do an assessment like this, a skills assessment. And this lab final, I have another talk about it that maybe I'll do again at a future convention. But this sort of lab final, this sort of practical assessment is one of the best things that we've ever done. It's totally revamped our lab program, and it's helped to encourage students to become passionate and to become engaged and to take real ownership for what they do in the lab, because they know that they're not just going to have to answer a multiple choice question about a solution preparation, but they're actually going to have to do it. The onus is actually on the students to develop those skills because they know they're going to be assessed on those skills directly. So what are the arguments for diploma exams? I'm hoping that this is maybe something that we can talk about on Twitter as a way to continue this discussion. Some of the arguments are that they're rigorous, they're hard, they're challenging for students, they prepare them for university. Perhaps they force teachers to give students practice taking multiple choice tests. I would agree with that. However, is that the best preparation for students taking university level courses? I'm not sure. There's a gatekeeping aspect here, right? We sort out the students. Who are the ones who should be going on to post-secondary? Who are the ones that shouldn't? Diploma exams end up determining that. Well, here, this wasn't the original intent of the exam. The intent wasn't for it to be an assessment of an individual student. It's supposed to be a broad scale look at how things are going on the whole. So one test on one particular day, I would argue, shouldn't make or break a student. Their ability to go on to post-secondary should be a result of a much broader scope of assessment than just a single test. Accountability for teachers and for schools. There's already pressure to teach to the test because these diploma exams end up being important for students and their prospects later on. And the more weight that is placed on them from an accountability point of view increases the pressure for students to teach the test rather than doing the curriculum justice. Some people argue that diploma exam writing, marking, validation is excellent teacher PD. I would agree. It is fantastic PD, but it has nothing to do with the student. The fact that I get good PD out of it, that I get paid for, is not a reason to subject the students to these tests and to have students go through writing these tests that end up mattering a lot for them. There would be ways to give really high quality assessment PD without having to create diploma exams. And equity, right? That everybody writes the same test on the same day in the same conditions. But it's a false sense of equity, I would argue there too, because students come in to write that test from a whole wide range of backgrounds. We know that students have different experiences at home, they have different things going on in their lives. So just because they write the same test on the same day doesn't mean that it's an equitable experience, right? It's an equal experience, but it's not equitable. And further to that, a whole ecosystem of diploma prep courses has arisen because of the high level of stress that students and families feel about the diploma exam. And so even though we write the same exam on the same day, some students will have paid to attend a 16-hour workshop the weekend before. Obviously, not all students can afford to do that. So at some time in the hopefully not too distant future, we will find ourselves in a post-COVID world, and we may move into our own roaring 20s. In the 1920s, coming out of years of war compounded by the pandemic, we entered into a period of prosperity and growth and development and change. And maybe the 2020s will be roaring too. And so in education, what do we want the roaring 20s to be? Well, for me, we want to remember the challenges of emergency remote learning and the lessons there. One of those being that we need to build the skills we want students to have. In the spring, when we went to emergency remote learning, a lot of the students who struggled did so because they were missing skills in time management, metacognition, problem solving, organization. They had difficulty advocating for themselves, communicating what they were struggling with. These are all skills that we need to build in students because they're important 21st century skills. So one of the things that we need to be doing as we move forward is paying closer attention to those 21st century skills and working to build those in students in the classroom, not just for the potential future global pandemics that they might experience, but for their everyday lives. And I would also propose that in our post-COVID world, we start the discussion about diploma exams. Are they serving our students? Are they enabling teachers to be good science educators? And if not, then consider what we can do to fix that situation and make sure that we're giving our students the best science education that we can be and preparing the future scientists and the future citizens of our province and our country. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this discussion about COVID and learning and standardized tests. And big thanks to my amazing colleagues at Spruce Grove Composite High School, who I don't know if I would have made it through all of this emergency remote learning without them, and especially to Pam Arneson and Brad Langdale, who have been my teaching buddies through emergency remote learning, and to whom I owe a big debt of gratitude. Big thanks, of course, also to my long-suffering family. Please do hop onto Twitter and tell me a bit about your experience during emergency remote learning. What things has it made you think about? And what are your thoughts about diploma exams and standardized tests? If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can do so with the email here, rmahaffey@psd.ab.ca, and you'll be able to find this talk on my website at mahaffey.ca/talks. Thanks so much.